young woman had been working at a secluded mansion in the suburbs for months, and she thought she knew every corner of the sprawling old house until one afternoon, she spotted her employer frantically sweeping leaves in the backyard. This was her chance to finally explore the mysterious parts of the house that was always kept locked away, and her curiosity burned stronger than her common sense as she crept through dusty hallways toward a heavy wooden door that looked untouched for decades. The lock gave way easily to her hairpin, but the moment the door creaked open, a horrifying gust of wind, reeking of rotting flesh and death, slammed into her face, making her feel queasy as she stepped into what felt like a tomb filled with disturbing objects. Shelves lined the room, displaying grotesque artifacts, and when she turned around, an ancient doll with a disfigured face startled her. Her hands trembled as she grabbed a massive leather-bound book from a dusty table, flipping it open to reveal detailed satanic ritual instructions, complete with symbols and incantations written. Nearby sat an old vinyl record with satanic sacrifice, written in faded letters on the cover, making her realize she had stumbled into something far more sinister than she could have imagined, and as she reached for a large glass jar to examine its murky contents, her employer's voice suddenly echoed through the house, calling for her. The shock made her fumble the jar, sending it crashing to the floor where it shattered into pieces, revealing what looked unmistakably like a human organ preserved in fluid, and the sight made her double over with nausea as panic took control. She could hear footsteps getting closer, so she dove behind covered objects just as the door swung open and her employer stepped inside, calling her name while scanning the room, and the woman grabbed the disturbing record and pressed it against her chest, holding her breath until her employer finally left. But just as she thought she was safe, one of the cloth coverings started moving on its own. The fabric slipped away to reveal an ornate mirror, and as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized that dozens of other mirrors throughout the room were also covered with similar cloths. Panic overtook her as she scrambled toward the door, desperate to escape before her employer returned. But to see how everything went so terribly wrong for this young woman, we need to go back to where it all started. Caroline was a 25-year-old nurse with a heart bigger than her paycheck, spending her days reading stories to dying patients at a rundown nursing hospital. One afternoon, while her gentle voice filled the sterile room with comfort, she watched helplessly as her favorite patient took his final breath, and when she reported his death to the staff with a broken heart, all they could manage was a cold and careless okay that made her realize she was working in a place that treated human beings like boxes on a shipping dock. The breaking point came when she understood that no matter how much love and care she poured into her work, the hospital system would never change, so she made the hardest decision of her career and quit her job, carrying the weight of all those lost patients on her shoulders as she searched for something better. Days later, while drowning her sorrows and uncertainty about the future, she spotted a job advertisement in the newspaper that seemed too good to be true, offering $1,000 a week for a hospice caregiver position. And even though her friend thought she was crazy for considering a job miles away in the Louisiana swamps, Caroline knew this was her chance to actually make a difference in someone's life, instead of watching them fade away in an uncaring system. The remote plantation mansion looked exactly like the kind of place where horror movies were filmed, surrounded by nothing but whispering winds and chirping birds that made the entire property feel abandoned and forgotten by time. But when Caroline knocked on the door and got no answer, she found it unlocked and stepped inside, only to be startled by a creepy statue before discovering an old woman in the garden cutting the hair of an even older man. The family lawyer suddenly appeared and welcomed Caroline with nervous energy, explaining that Mr. DeVirox had suffered a devastating stroke a month ago that left him paralyzed and unable to speak, while his wife Mrs. DeVirox was struggling to cope with watching her husband waste away. But when the lawyer introduced Caroline to her new employer, the old woman's reaction was colder than a Louisiana winter morning. Mrs. DeVirox refused to even acknowledge Caroline's existence, making it crystal clear that Caroline would be just another failed caregiver who would either quit or disappear like all the others before her. And the way she said it made Caroline's skin crawl, with the suggestion that something bad had happened to the previous nurses. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and Caroline was ready to walk away from the whole mess, when the lawyer desperately tried to convince her that taking care of Mr. DeVirox would be the easiest job she ever had, even though his nervous stammering and the way Mrs. DeVirox glared at her suggested that this house was hiding secrets much darker than a simple stroke patient. Without wasting another second, Caroline grabbed the job offer and rushed home to pack her life into boxes with the help of her friend Jill, who jokingly warned her not to come back acting like some old lady who spent her days knitting and playing bingo. But Caroline was too excited about her fresh start to worry about anything except getting to the mansion as fast as possible. Her excitement quickly turned to panic when her car sputtered to a stop on the lonely highway, completely out of gas, forcing her to pull into the creepiest gas station she had ever seen, where a strange line of brick dust was scattered across the front entrance like some kind of weird ritual barrier that made her skin crawl. The strange artifacts around the station stared at her with suspicious eyes, especially one wicked-looking old grandmother, whose evil glare made Caroline jump out of her skin. And when a mysterious man appeared out of nowhere behind her to collect payment for her gas without saying a single word, she couldn't wait to get back on the road and away from that nightmare place. When Caroline finally arrived at the mansion and started unpacking her belongings in her new room, she immediately noticed something disturbing about the walls, which had clear frame marks where mirrors used to hang. but there wasn't a single mirror anywhere in the entire house, making her wonder what kind of people were afraid of their own reflections. Her first meeting with Mr. Th3 nearly gave her a heart attack when the supposedly paralyzed man suddenly grabbed her wrist, with a grip so tight and strong that she thought he might crush her bones. His eyes filled with a terror and desperation that seemed to be trying to warn her about something before Mrs. Th3 rushed into the room with medications and broke the spell. The old woman then asked Caroline the strangest question she had ever heard, wanting to know if she had any tattoos or marks on her body, and when Caroline said no, Mrs. Th3 seemed oddly relieved as she began explaining Caroline's daily duties as a caregiver. But Caroline's curiosity got the better of her and she asked about the history of the creepy mansion. Mrs. Th3 explained that she and her husband had bought the house back in 1962 from a brother and sister named Martin and Grace, and while she was talking, Caroline spotted an old family photograph showing 2 adults and 2 children with a note on the back that read Papa Justify and Mama Cecile, names that sounded like they belonged in some kind of voodoo story rather than a normal family photo. The conversation took an even more ominous turn when Mrs. Th3 handed Caroline a skeleton key that could supposedly open 30 different doors throughout the massive mansion, but then strictly warned her that the attic was completely off limits, and she was never to go up there under any circumstances. And when Caroline asked about the missing mirrors, the old woman just shrugged and claimed that old people like them didn't need mirrors anymore, which was the weirdest excuse Caroline had ever heard and made her wonder what they were really trying to hide. The next morning found Mrs. Th3 in her garden pulling weeds and trimming dead flowers, while Caroline pushed Mr. Th3 around the property in his wheelchair, enjoying what seemed like a peaceful routine until the old woman suddenly demanded that Caroline fetch some seeds from the forbidden attic, which felt like a trap, but Caroline had no choice but to climb those creaky stairs with her skeleton key. Inside the dusty attic room, a strange rattling sound coming from behind an old fireplace caught her attention and drew her toward a hidden door that refused to open no matter how hard she twisted the key, and just when she thought she might break the lock, another door swung open behind her and nearly gave her a heart attack before she grabbed the seed packet and rushed back downstairs. Mrs. Th3 was waiting in the hallway with suspicious eyes, demanding to know why Caroline had taken so long, and when Caroline nervously asked about the attic's history, the old woman claimed she had never set foot in that room herself, which was obviously a lie since she knew exactly where the seeds were stored. The conversation got even weirder when Caroline mentioned that the lawyer had told her Mr. Th3 suffered his stroke in the attic, but Mrs. Th3 just snapped at Caroline,
"You'll have to ask him, child,"
which was impossible since he couldn't speak. That night a violent thunderstorm shook the entire mansion, and a terrible crash somewhere in the house jolted Caroline awake, sending her running to check on Mr. Th3 only to find his bed completely empty, which should have been impossible since he was supposedly paralyzed and bedridden. Panic took over as she searched every room on the ground floor, before finally looking up and spotting the old man crawling across the slippery roof tiles like some kind of zombie, and when she screamed for him to stop moving, he lost his grip and plummeted into the muddy yard below. She pounded on Mrs. Th3's bedroom door until the old woman came rushing downstairs to help, but the moment Caroline tried to assist the injured man, he lunged at her with wild eyes and tried to claw her face, forcing Mrs. Th3 to send Caroline back inside to fetch the wheelchair. While collecting the wheelchair from his room, Caroline discovered something that made her blood run cold, a message carved into the bedsheet that read "Help me" in desperate scratchy letters, and she quickly hid the evidence in a cabinet before returning to help the couple, all while Mr. Th3 stared at her with the most helpless and terrified expression she had ever seen. The next morning the family lawyer showed up to update Mrs. Th3's will, and Caroline thought this was her chance to get some answers, so she told him about the mysterious message she had found carved in the bedsheet. But when they went to examine the evidence together, the sheet was completely blank as if the words had never existed, leaving Caroline feeling like she was losing her mind. All these strange incidents involving Mr. Th3 made Caroline realize that the supposedly paralyzed man was desperately trying to warn her about something dangerous, and she began to suspect that someone or something in the house was preventing him from communicating the truth about what was really happening in that cursed mansion. The next morning we get to see what happened in the beginning of the video as Caroline takes advantage of Mrs. Th3 sweeping the backyard and quickly sneaks back to the attic, unlocks the door with her skeleton key to discover all the strange ritual objects, hides when the old woman comes looking for her, and escapes with the record labeled "The Conjure of Sacrifice." Caroline brought the mysterious record back to her apartment and played it alone in her room, listening to Papa Justify's gravelly voice chanting an ancient incantation that made her blood run cold. But just as the words reached their terrifying climax, Jill approached behind her and froze in horror at the demonic sounds filling the room. The two friends rushed to a nearby bar to calm their nerves with strong drinks, while Jill quickly explained that hoodoo was American folk magic from New Orleans that only worked on true believers, unlike voodoo, which was an actual religion.
How's hoodoo different? It's magic, American folk magic. God doesn't have much to do with it.
And Caroline realized she had stumbled into something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. The next morning, Mrs. Th3 completely lost her mind when she discovered that Caroline had hung a mirror in Mr. Th3's bedroom, smashing a flower vase in her fury before ripping down every mirror and screaming that mirrors were absolutely forbidden in the house. Caroline had reached her breaking point with all the secrecy and lies, so she cornered Mrs. de Vierox and threatened to pack her bags and leave forever, unless the old woman finally told her the truth about what was really happening in the cursed mansion. Faced with losing another caregiver, Mrs. de Vierox led Caroline into the garden and warned her that, as a northerner, she might never understand the dark history of the South, that the house belonged to the spirits just as much as it belonged to the living. And then she began telling the most horrifying story Caroline had ever heard. 90 years ago, a cruel banker who built his fortune by cheating poor families moved into the mansion with his wife, 2 children, and 2 servants named Papa Justify and Mama Cecile, who were famous throughout Louisiana as powerful conjurers who could heal the sick and curse the wicked using ancient hoodoo magic from their workspace in the attic. The banker treated them like property and worked them to death. But everything changed the night he threw a lavish anniversary party for all his wealthy friends, and when the celebration ended, and the guests went looking for the banker's children to say goodbye, they found the kids in the attic learning a terrifying ritual called the Conjure of Sacrifice from Papa Justify and Mama Cecile. The horrified party guests dragged the servants outside and accused them of corrupting innocent children with devil worship. And even though the kids screamed that they had begged to learn the magic, the banker and his friends hung Papa Justify and Mama Cecile from a tree and burned their bodies while the children watched in absolute terror. The banker's business collapsed within months, and he shot his wife and then himself, leaving everyone in town whispering that the spirits of Papa Justify and Mama Cecile had claimed their vengeance from beyond the grave. The banker's traumatized children lived in the haunted house until 1962, when they sold it to the de Vierox family without mentioning the brutal murders or the evil that still lingered in the attic. But when strange and terrifying things began happening to the new owners, they covered all the mirrors and locked the attic door tight, which seemed to keep the spirits quiet until Caroline arrived and started stirring up trouble. Mrs. de Vierox finished her story by telling Caroline that she would completely understand if she wanted to run away like all the other maids who had fled after learning the truth about the house's bloody past. Caroline tried to shake off the mansion's creepiness, but one lazy afternoon, as she lugged a basket of laundry across the yard, she spotted a jar of brick dust tucked inside an old shed, and the sight sent a chill racing down her spine. Yet she pressed on with her chores and soon wheeled Mr. de Vierox into the bathroom for his daily bath, where she held up her little mirror to fix her face and kept it aside. But the old man looked at the mirror. Caroline showed it to him, but the instant his gaze hit the glass, the frail man jerked in raw terror and began to tremble so violently that Caroline slammed the door and begged him to forgive her for scaring him. That shaken moment convinced her the house hid something rotten, so she pretended she needed a shopping run and slipped into town, heading straight to the hidden hoodoo shop run by Jill's Aunt Cynthia, a tiny storefront disguised as a laundry, where shelves overflowed with spell books and jars of strange powders. Cynthia showed Caroline the brick dust and learned it keeps enemies from crossing a doorway, then poured out every bizarre sign she had seen and begged for help, because she was sure a spell was choking Mr. de Vierox's voice and trapping his body. Cynthia agreed and packed a bundle of candles, oils, and herbs to break the curse. Late that night, when the house lay silent, Caroline lit the candles and made arrangements for the ritual on the bed and whispered Cynthia's counter spell, and bit by bit, the paralyzed man forced out a raspy syllable, then another, until he croaked her name, repeated "help me" over and over, and pointed a shaking finger straight at his wife as footsteps thundered in the hall, and Mrs. de Vierox burst inside demanding to know what Caroline was doing. So Caroline spun a quick lie about telling a bedtime story, and the old woman drove her from the room while Mr. de Vierox fell silent once more. Sleep finally came, but it dragged a nightmare with it, a vision of Papa Justify and Mama Cecile slicing strands of her hair and binding her eyes and mouth while the house swallowed her screams. And when she bolted upright and checked the time, her mirror flashed a shadow slipping from her bedroom door, though no one answered when she called for Mrs. de Vierox. At dawn, she stuffed clothes into a suitcase, determined to flee, yet one look at the helpless old man and one memory of her father's last days made her change her mind, so she unpacked and swore she would finish what she started. Caroline rushed to Luke's office with photographs of all the creepy ritual objects she had discovered in the attic, and her desperation to understand what was happening at the mansion pushed her to demand information about the previous hospice nurse, so Luke reluctantly introduced her to a woman named Hallie, who took one look at Caroline's photos and begged her to run away from that house immediately because it was soaked in blood and tears from decades of evil. Caroline dragged the skeptical lawyer to the gas station to show him the magical protection items, though Luke rolled his eyes and refused to believe anything about supernatural forces, and when the familiar sound of a record playing led them inside, they found a blind woman who snapped at Caroline rudely until she mentioned Papa Justify and his conjuring record, which made the woman freeze in terror and whisper that the conjuring spell was the most powerful magic ever created because it prevented death by allowing the caster to steal all their victims' remaining years of life. They got out of the place, and Luke demanded proof before he would take action, so Caroline returned to the mansion and immediately searched for the record she had hidden in her briefcase, but it had mysteriously disappeared, confirming her worst fears that Mrs. de Vierox knew exactly what Caroline had discovered. Caroline sprinkled protective brick dust across her bedroom doorway and tested the old woman by inviting her into a room, pretending there was a leak in the ceiling that needed attention. And just as she suspected, Mrs. DeVirox made excuse after excuse about having supper on the stove rather than step across the door, even refusing to enter when Caroline asked her to grab a towel. With her suspicions confirmed, Caroline told Mr. DeVirox they were escaping that very night, then executed her desperate plan by secretly dropping sleeping powder into Mrs. DeVirox's sugar cubes and watching the old woman stir the drugged sweetener into her coffee. During dinner, they started to argue with each other, but the sedative began to take effect. Caroline confronted Mrs. DeVirox about the spell and demanded to know what she had done to her husband, but before the old woman could confess everything, the drug knocked her unconscious and she collapsed to the floor, though even while falling she tried to complete the conjuring ritual until Caroline ripped the spell paper from her trembling hands. Caroline frantically searched the house until she found the missing record, along with strands of her own hair that Mrs. DeVirox had been collecting for the ritual. Then she grabbed Mr. DeVirox and rushed him to her car, only to discover that the mansion's iron gates were locked tight and blocking their escape route. So she backed up the car and gunned the engine straight at the gates, hoping to crash through to freedom, but the metal bars held firm and her desperate attempt to break free failed. All hell broke loose when Mrs. DeVirox woke up from her drugged sleep and grabbed a rifle, turning the mansion into a hunting ground as she searched for Caroline and her escaped husband, screaming that Caroline was too weak to ever leave this cursed house alive. Caroline managed to hide Mr. DeVirox in a safe spot and promised she would come back for him, then made a desperate run through the dark swamps toward town, dodging rifle shots as Mrs. DeVirox chased her all the way to the water, where Caroline jumped into an old rowboat and paddled frantically toward Luke's office. She burst through the lawyer's door and spilled everything about Mrs. DeVirox's evil plan, but while she was talking, Luke received a phone call from the old woman who told him a completely different version of the story, and Caroline's blood turned to ice when she realized something was terribly wrong. While Luke pretended to listen to her fears, Caroline noticed that his office cabinet was filled with the same ritual objects she had seen in the attic, and when she opened his desk drawer, she found dozens of photographs of herself taken secretly, along with Papa Justify's ring and her own skeleton key that she thought she had lost. Luke suddenly appeared behind her and wrapped his hands around her throat, choking her until she blacked out completely, and when Caroline woke up with her mouth gagged and her hands tied, she found herself trapped in the lawyer's car as he drove her straight back to the mansion where Mrs. DeVirox was waiting with a twisted smile. Luke dragged Caroline into the main hall and demanded that she tell them where she had hidden Mr. DeVirox, but Caroline refused to give up the helpless old man, even when they threatened to torture her, until she suddenly remembered the protective brick dust she had scattered in her bedroom and realized it was her only chance to escape. She lied and told them where Mr. DeVirox was hiding, then claimed she needed to get her father's picture from her room as a final request, and when Luke tried to follow her inside, she fought him off, and the magical barrier prevented him from entering. Caroline forced the door shut, then escaped through the windows and broke her ties. With Luke and the old woman after her, Caroline raced up a ladder to the second floor, and she frantically sprinkled protective dust around every doorway and window to create a magical prison that would keep her enemies from reaching her. But Mrs. DeVirox was already waiting upstairs and blew a handful of cursed powder right into Caroline's face. The two women fought like wildcats, clawing and punching each other until Caroline managed to shove Mrs. DeVirox backward, sending the old witch tumbling down the stairs where she hit the floor with a sickening crack and lay motionless while Luke screamed in rage from downstairs. Caroline grabbed the telephone and locked herself in a room to call for help, but when she dialed the police and then Jill, the phone line went dead, leaving her completely alone and trapped in a house with two psychotic killers. With nowhere else to run, Caroline climbed up to the forbidden attic and set up her own protective ritual, lighting a circle of candles and placing mirrors around the edges before pulling out the conjure protection spell she had learned from Mama Cynthia. She drew a double circle around herself with trembling hands, recreated the magical symbols with chalk, cut off a lock of her hair, and pricked her palm to let drops of blood fall onto the wooden floor, desperately hoping the ancient magic would keep her safe from whatever horror was coming next. Mrs. DeVirox limped into the attic with blood trickling from her head wound, and revealed the most shocking truth of all, confessing that she had been manipulating Caroline from the very beginning by changing the words in the spell book and waiting for her to believe in the magic strongly enough to make it work against her.
Doesn't work if you don't believe.
The old woman held up a large mirror that reflected not just Caroline's terrified face, but also the ghostly images of the banker's daughter, Mrs. DeVirox herself, and the vengeful spirit of Mama Cecile. And as the supernatural mirror began moving toward Caroline like a weapon, she realized she had walked straight into the deadliest trap of her life. The mirror slammed into her, hindering her unconscious and causing a small explosion. The moment their eyes opened, the shocking truth became clear: they had switched bodies. Caroline's spirit now lived inside Mrs. DeVirox's body, while the lawyer who climbed into the attic was revealed to be Papa Justify himself. They smiled, proud of their trick, as it came out that Mrs. DeVirox's body had been possessed by Mama Cecile all these years. Now Mama Cecile had taken over Caroline's body and planned to live out the rest of her years there. Meanwhile, the real Caroline, trapped inside Mrs. DeVirox's trembling form, was given a potion that would paralyze her, just like Mr. DeVirox. The two servants, Papa Justify and Mama Cecile, had been using hoodoo magic to extend their lives by swapping bodies, just like they had possessed and drained the life from the banker's two children long ago. The story ends with Caroline stuck in Mrs. de Virox's body, and the real lawyer trapped in Mr. de Virox's, both unable to speak or escape. Jill arrives with an ambulance to rescue the paralyzed couple, but Caroline, in Mrs. de Virox's form, can only stare helplessly, desperate to share the terrible story they experienced. Papa Justify tells Jill that Mrs. and Mr. de Virox have left the mansion to Caroline, now Mama Cecile, in their will, meaning she will remain there forever. As the final scene fades, Cecile and Justify continue to live in the mansion, occupying the young bodies of Caroline and the lawyer, haunting the house with their dark magic.